For centuries, the Philistines have been a riddle wrapped in a reputation. Most of us know them as the enemies of ancient Israel, the people who fought Samson, clashed with King David, and gave us the word Philistine to mean someone uncultured or crude. But what if we've been wrong about them this whole time? What if the people we've long dismissed as violent outsiders were actually something much more fascinating and more complex? Thanks to an incredible scientific breakthrough, researchers have finally uncovered the truth about where the Philistines came from. And it's not what the ancient scribes or even modern historians expected. Deep beneath the ruins of ancient Ashkelon, one of the Philistines' major cities, a team of scientists extracted DNA from 3,000-year-old human remains. And what they discovered is rewriting history. Far from being just another local tribe, the Philistines carried genetic markers that connect them to southern Europe. In other words, they weren't native to the land they eventually call home. They were migrants, possibly shipborne refugees from the collapse of great Bronze Age kingdoms across the Mediterranean. They were survivors, sailors, and settlers who arrived on the shores of the Levant and brought with them new customs, languages, and identities. This video isn't just about genetics. It's about how science can break open long-held myths. It's about how people on the margins of the historical record can suddenly take center stage. And it's about how the story of the Philistines, once seen through the lens of enemies, now reveals a tale of migration, blending, and unexpected legacy. So let's dive deep into ancient ashes, cross turbulent seas, and follow the ancient DNA trail that finally tells us, who were the Philistines really? Before modern genetics stepped in, much of what we knew or thought we knew about the Philistines came from their enemies. Most famously, the Hebrew Bible describes them as antagonists to the Israelites. Stories of Samson and Delilah, or David and Goliath, have painted the Philistines as brutish warriors and cultural outsiders. But such depictions were shaped by conflict, not objectivity. So, who were the Philistines really? Archaeologists have been trying to answer this question for over a century. Excavations in cities like Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, Gaza, and Ashdod, known as the 5 major Philistine city-states, have revealed a far more sophisticated society than the ancient texts suggest. These cities boasted advanced urban planning, monumental architecture, and skilled artisanship. Pottery found in Philistine sites displays clear influence from Mycenaean Greece, suggesting cultural links to the wider Mediterranean world. Their diet, too, offers clues. Philistine settlements show a marked difference in food habits compared to their neighbors. They consumed pork, a taboo for both Israelites and Canaanites. They also brewed beer and used olive oil in abundance. These dietary habits hint at a different origin, something rooted not in Semitic culture, but possibly in southern Europe or the Aegean. Linguistically, the picture is hazy. The Philistines left behind few inscriptions, and we still don't fully understand their language. However, the words and names that do survive, like Goliath, which resembles Indo-European names, offer subtle suggestions of foreign roots. The Philistines didn't remain isolated for long. Over time, they began to adopt local customs, languages, and religious practices. Their gods blended with Canaanite deities, and their material culture grew increasingly Levantine in style. This process of integration suggests they were not just invaders, but settlers who eventually became part of the region's complex tapestry. It's important to remember that the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, when the Philistines arrived, was a period of massive upheaval. Entire empires were collapsing. People were migrating, trading, and searching for stability. In this chaotic backdrop, the Philistines likely arrived as one of many displaced groups navigating a fractured world. So rather than seeing them as mere villains or outsiders, a more accurate picture begins to emerge. The Philistines were a people shaped by migration, driven by the tides of history, and transformed through interaction with their neighbors. They were products of cultural fusion, Mediterranean migrants who carved out a new identity in a contested land. Thanks to archaeology and now genetics, the veil is lifting. The Philistines were more than their biblical reputation. They were resilient, adaptable, and surprisingly cosmopolitan for their time. Long before DNA could speak for the dead, Scholars and historians pieced together the origins of the Philistines using archaeology, ancient texts, and cultural clues. One of the oldest and most widely accepted theories suggested that the Philistines were part of a larger confederation known as the Sea Peoples, a mysterious group that swept through the eastern Mediterranean around the 12th century BCE. This theory was largely built on Egyptian records. The most famous is a temple relief at Medinet Habu, commissioned by Pharaoh Ramses III, which depicts a chaotic battle against invaders from a sea. These sea peoples were described as technologically advanced and well-organized, arriving with ox-drawn carts, women, and children, indicating they were not just raiders, but full-blown migrant communities. Among these groups, the Peleset are mentioned, believed by many to be the Philistines. Supporting this theory, archaeologists noticed that around the same time these invasions were said to occur, 5 new cities sprang up along the southern coast of Canaan: Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, Gaza, and Ekron. The material culture in these cities was strikingly different from what had come before. Pottery styles, weaponry, and architectural techniques all showed signs of influence from the Aegean region, particularly Mycenaean Greece. In the 20th century, scholars speculated that the Philistines might have originated from places like Crete or mainland Greece, driven by some combination of natural disaster, political upheaval, or economic collapse. This hypothesis tied them to the broader collapse of Bronze Age civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean. The Philistines, according to this view, were displaced Mycenaeans or other Aegean refugees who settled in the Levant and forged a new identity. Others posited a connection with Cyprus, based on similarities in pottery and art. Still, there was little consensus. Every artifact seemed to raise more questions. Were they Greeks, Anatolians, Cypriots, or perhaps a fusion of several seafaring cultures? Biblical accounts painted them as invaders from Kaftor, often identified with Crete. This added a religious and moral dimension to the theory, casting the Philistines as heathen intruders in the sacred land of Israel. But even these texts were not written at the time of the events they describe, leaving scholars cautious about taking them at face value. Despite these uncertainties, most researchers agreed on one point: the Philistines were not originally from Canaan. Their sudden appearance, distinct cultural elements, and references in Egyptian and biblical texts all pointed to an origin across the sea. But exactly where that was, and how they got there, remained open to debate. That is, until science offered a new lens. With the development of ancient DNA extraction and sequencing, researchers could now go beyond pottery shards and inscriptions. They could look directly into the bones of the Philistines themselves, and what they found would challenge even the most established theories. For decades, the origins of the Philistines were pieced together from broken pots and cryptic texts. But in 2019, science delivered an astonishing leap forward. A team of geneticists and archaeologists published groundbreaking research based on ancient DNA extracted from skeletons found in Ashkelon, one of the key Philistine cities. These bones had rested for over 3,000 years beneath layers of earth and history, but within them were answers scholars had sought for centuries. The research was led by the Leon Levy Expedition and the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History. Their goal was bold: to sequence the genomes of individuals from multiple time periods in Ashkelon, covering both the pre-Philistine Canaanite population and those from the early Philistine period. By comparing the two groups, they hoped to determine whether the Philistines were genetically distinct and, more importantly, where they came from. The results were stunning. The DNA from individuals dated to the early Iron Age, roughly the 12th century BCE, when the Philistines are believed to have arrived, revealed clear traces of European ancestry. This genetic signal was absent in the earlier Bronze Age population of Ashkelon, which matched local Canaanite profiles. The newly introduced DNA showed strong similarities to southern European populations, particularly from regions like Greece, Sardinia, and Iberia. In other words, a foreign population had indeed arrived in Ashkelon during the time associated with the Philistines. Their genetic fingerprints were distinct, and they matched the direction of migration long hypothesized from archaeological evidence. For the first time, scientists had biological proof that the Philistines were not native to the Levant. They had crossed the sea, bringing with them not just new pottery and weapons, but their very bloodlines. Yet this foreign DNA did not remain isolated for long. Within just a few generations, later Philistine skeletons from Ashkelon showed signs of significant intermixing with the local population. The European genetic component began to fade as the newcomers blended with their Canaanite neighbors. This reflected what historians had long suspected, that the Philistines, while originally foreign, became increasingly integrated into the cultural and genetic fabric of the region. One of the most remarkable aspects of this study was how it combined disciplines. Archaeology, linguistics, and ancient history had all pointed toward a Mediterranean migration. But it was genetics that confirmed it, and not through guesswork, but through hard data, sequences of DNA drawn directly from the ancient people themselves. This breakthrough did more than confirm old theories, it refined them. It provided a precise window into the timing, scale, and impact of the Philistine migration, and it demonstrated how the tools of modern science can peel back the layers of time to answer questions once thought unsolvable. With these results in hand, researchers could now ask even deeper questions. Where exactly in Europe had these migrants come from? What drove them to the shores of Canaan? And how did they reshape the political and cultural landscape of the ancient Near East? While the genetic findings from Ashkelon confirmed a European connection to the early Philistines, the story doesn't end with their arrival. In fact, what followed was a rapid and profound transformation. Within just a few generations, the genetic signal of European ancestry began to blend and eventually fade, absorbed into the dominant genetic landscape of the Near East. This raised a fascinating question. What role did the local Canaanite population play in shaping the identity of the Philistines? To understand this, we need to look at the region the Philistines came to inhabit. Along the southern Levantine coast, today's Israel and Gaza, Canaanite cities had existed for centuries. These cities, including Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron, were rich in culture, economy, and history. They had their own languages, religious traditions, and complex social structures. When the Philistines arrived, they didn't displace these people completely. Instead, they settled alongside them. The genetic evidence shows clear intermarriage and mixing between the newcomers and the locals almost immediately. By the 10th century BCE, just 2 or 3 generations after the first Philistine burials with European DNA, the genetic signatures of the population were nearly indistinguishable from surrounding Canaanite communities. This was not a foreign elite ruling over natives. It was a merger, a fusion that transformed both groups. Culturally, this is reflected in the archaeological record as well. Early Philistine pottery shows clear Aegean influences, spiral designs, bird motifs, and other hallmarks of Mycenaean style. But over time, these designs began to adopt more local traits. Religious practices, burial customs, and even diet began to shift. Pig bones, for example, which were abundant in early Philistine sites and rare in Israelite areas, gradually declined, suggesting cultural blending or adaptation. Language is another revealing piece. The Philistines likely spoke an Indo-European language at first, perhaps related to Greek or Luwian, but within a century or two, they adopted the local Semitic tongues. By the time of the Hebrew Bible, the Philistines were culturally and linguistically part of the Levant, even if their reputation as foreigners persisted in memory. This absorption doesn't mean the Philistines disappeared. Rather, it illustrates how fluid identity was in the ancient world. The European ancestry introduced by the Philistines became a layer within the already diverse tapestry of the Near East. Over time, that layer was woven in so tightly with others that it became indistinguishable from them. This tells us something profound about how civilizations develop, not through isolation, but through contact, exchange, and adaptation. The Philistine experience also sheds light on the Canaanites themselves. Often portrayed as passive victims of conquest in biblical narratives, the Canaanites here emerge as resilient and influential. Their culture didn't collapse under the weight of foreign arrival. It absorbed, adapted, and endured. In doing so, it reshaped those who came to conquer. So, while the Philistines may have arrived by sea, it was the land, and the people already rooted there, that ultimately shaped who they became. And through this blending, both groups were transformed, leaving behind a legacy that still echoes in the soil, language, and DNA of the region today. When we think of the Philistines, their legacy is often tied to biblical stories, Goliath, Samson, and the conflicts with the Israelites. But long before these dramatic tales were told, the Philistines played a far more consequential role in the ancient world, especially in the history of Egypt. Their arrival didn't just disrupt the Levant. It sent shockwaves all the way into the heart of one of the world's oldest civilizations. The Philistines were part of the larger confederation of the so-called Sea Peoples, mysterious maritime groups who appeared suddenly around 1200 BCE, during a period of widespread collapse across the eastern Mediterranean. This was a time when entire empires crumbled. Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire, and Ugarit all fell within a few decades. Egypt, too, was under siege. The great pharaoh Ramses III recorded in vivid detail how these sea peoples tried to invade his kingdom, both by land and sea. Among these attackers were the Peleset, widely believed by scholars to be the Philistines. In inscriptions at Medinet Habu, Ramses III claimed victory over them, portraying the sea peoples as wild, foreign invaders. But the truth may be more complex. Rather than being completely defeated, many scholars believe that some sea peoples, including the Philistines, were not destroyed but resettled. Egypt may have allowed or even encouraged them to settle in southern Canaan, creating a buffer zone between Egypt and its northern rivals. This changed Egypt's geopolitical landscape dramatically. No longer was Canaan a quiet Egyptian province or vassal zone. With the Philistines installed along the coast, Egypt's influence in the Levant became more indirect. They couldn't control it the way they once had. The Philistines brought military innovation, fortified cities, and fierce independence. They quickly became one of the most powerful forces in the region, challenging Egyptian dominance without ever needing to invade again. Beyond politics, the Philistines influenced Egyptian culture in more subtle ways. Trade between Egypt and Philistine cities became common. Goods flowed in both directions: pottery, grains, luxury items, and perhaps even ideas. Some scholars suggest that Egyptian art in the late New Kingdom period began to reflect Aegean and Levantine styles, an influence that may have come from Philistine interactions. Even the presence of foreign mercenaries in Egyptian armies, many from Aegean or Anatolian backgrounds, may reflect this wider trend of cultural entanglement sparked by the Sea People's arrival. But perhaps the greatest impact was psychological. The invasions of the Sea Peoples, including the Philistines, marked the end of Egypt's era of expansion. After Ramses III, the Egyptian empire never again reached the same heights. The idea that foreigners could breach the Nile Delta and challenge the pharaoh shook Egyptian confidence and identity. It forced Egypt to look inward, become more defensive, and eventually contributed to its fragmentation during the Third Intermediate Period. In short, the Philistines didn't just change the Levant, they helped usher in the end of the Bronze Age and a new chapter in Egyptian history. They were not merely invaders or migrants, they were catalysts of transformation. Through battle, settlement, and cultural contact, they reshaped the power dynamics of the ancient world. The story of the Philistines and their impact on Egypt forces us to rethink a long-standing assumption that ancient civilizations viewed outsiders only as enemies or invaders. In the case of Egypt, the arrival of the Philistines and other sea peoples in the early 12th century BCE didn't just provoke conflict. It also reshaped how Egyptians understood the concept of foreignness. Their presence challenged old narratives and introduced a new, more complex relationship between Egypt and the peoples beyond its borders. In traditional Egyptian ideology, foreigners were often portrayed as chaotic, uncivilized, or even dangerous. This was not just a cultural bias, it was a political statement. Egypt's rulers claimed divine order Ma'at as their mandate, and outsiders were often depicted as threats to that order. Wall reliefs showed pharaohs triumphing over bowing Asiatics or trampling Nubians. Foreigners were visual symbols of disorder that the king alone could control. But the historical record tells a more nuanced story. Long before the Philistines arrived, Egypt was already interacting with other cultures, trading with Mesopotamia, exchanging gifts with the Aegean, and employing foreign mercenaries. The arrival of the Philistines simply accelerated a process that had already begun, the blending of Egyptian identity with the wider world. The Philistines may have entered Egypt's orbit through violence, but they stayed through integration. Egyptian records from the time of Ramses III suggest not just war, but resettlement. The Philistines weren't all killed or expelled. They were absorbed into the geopolitical structure of a region, eventually establishing powerful city-states like Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gaza. Egypt, rather than fighting prolonged wars, may have chosen pragmatic coexistence. In doing so, it acknowledged a foreign presence, not as a temporary nuisance, but as a permanent reality. This marked a shift. Foreignness was no longer a distant threat. It was now part of daily life. Philistine pottery, clothing styles, and military techniques appeared in regions under Egyptian influence. Egyptian merchants and diplomats began dealing with Philistine leaders as equals. The rigid boundary between Egyptian and other began to blur. Genetic and archaeological findings support this new perspective. Remains from coastal Canaanite cities show a mixture of local Levantine DNA and markers from the Aegean region, consistent with the idea that the Philistines were migrants who blended into existing populations. Over generations, these groups adopted local languages, intermarried, and shaped the cultural landscape. Egypt wasn't assimilating them so much as adjusting to a new normal. This had lasting consequences. Later Egyptian texts began to describe foreigners less as nameless threats and more as identifiable neighbors or even partners. This is visible in how the Libyans, Nubians, and Sea peoples were represented in art and writing, not just as enemies, but as groups with distinct identities and roles within Egypt's changing world. Ultimately, the Philistines and others like them pushed Egypt toward a more layered understanding of identity. Foreignness became less about opposition and more about interaction. The Philistines weren't just outsiders. They were participants in Egypt's story, contributors to its economy, and mirrors of its shifting place in the ancient Mediterranean. For centuries, the word Philistine has carried a strange afterlife, used in modern languages to mean someone uncultured or uncivilized. Ironically, this modern insult stems from misunderstandings and biases that archaeology and genetics are now helping to correct. The real Philistines were not cultural barbarians. They were dynamic settlers, seafarers, and contributors to the ancient world's complex tapestry. Today, their legacy lives on in more ways than many might realize. For one, they left behind an enduring archaeological imprint. The 5 great Philistine city-states, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza, were hubs of innovation. Excavations have uncovered distinctive pottery styles, fortifications, and temples that blend Aegean and Near Eastern elements. These findings reveal a people who embraced hybrid identities, neither entirely foreign nor wholly local. Genetic research has also played a vital role in reshaping their image. Ancient DNA from burials in Ashkelon, for instance, showed early Philistines had clear genetic ties to southern Europe, most likely the Aegean, before becoming genetically indistinguishable from their Levantine neighbors within a few generations. This means that while they arrived as outsiders, they didn't remain that way for long. They became part of a local gene pool and culture, adding new layers to the region's human story. Politically, the Philistines' memory is tied to the geography of modern-day Palestine, which shares their name. While there is no direct genetic or political continuity between the ancient Philistines and present populations, the historical name has persisted through waves of empire, migration, and identity shifts. Ultimately, the Philistine story is one of movement, adaptation, and influence. Far from being a lost or irrelevant people, they stand as a reminder that cultural exchange and migration have shaped civilizations for millennia, just as they continue to do today.